Dr. Erin Heyman. She's with Neola, and she has a degree in English and a doctoral degree in curriculum instruction, and she's been doing this a long time with a lot of different folks. She's one of the kind of national experts in this area from Neola. And so she's going to work with us today in terms of how to develop and work with doing student learning outcomes in the state of the art today, I guess is the best way to put it. Does that seem reasonable?
That seems reasonable.
And anything else that you would like me to say before we begin?
No, I don't think so, unless you want to frame the day at all, or Sarah want to say a few words on how this day got started.
Sure. So this morning session is focused on identifying or developing an assignment that will align to one of the disciplinary learning outcomes. And this afternoon we'll have another session that will work on developing learning outcomes for student affairs co-curricular programs. We'll also, the General Education Assessment Committee will be meeting with Dr. Heyman at lunch to discuss faculty-led assessments, and at the end of the day we hope to debrief with her with the University Assessment Committee as well as a few other folks that are leading assessment efforts here on campus, kind of to learn maybe how we can best position ourselves for our next accreditation visit as far as assessment efforts.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome, we're so glad to have you here
Thank
today.
you. Thank you very much. Well, welcome everybody. Donuts or fruit or coffee or all of the above, so you can get ready for a few hours with me. And thank you for being here. Framing the day, and I'll introduce myself a little bit more as well. We want to go over a little bit of effective assessment practices and effective assignment principles, so that really the main part of this is you guys doing the work. How fun is that, right? So we're going to do an assignment charrette, and I'll certainly talk about that and what that means, but it's been a really effective way through NILOA. I mean, it's happened before in the past, of course, but NILOA has taken it and put together a process that helps you all who have assignments and, you know, rubber meets the road where you're really looking for the students to learn their outcomes, and attaching the assignments that you hope will obviously get them to the point where they can demonstrate those outcomes. So a charrette is just a kind of a quick run through. It came from architecture and design, where they literally put their architecture projects in a cart and they'd move them table to table, and people would do their critiques of that sort of in this round robin area. So it's been modified from that, but it's been around for quite some time. Again, I'll talk more about that. So that's really going to be the biggest part. There aren't 40 people in here, so we can't have time to talk a little bit about who you guys are. I'm Erin, as Dale said. I've been in assessment and faculty development for probably 15 years or so. Interestingly, I got to this point through sort of a roundabout way. Started teaching English at University of Colorado, in my hometown, my home state of Colorado. Started teaching at 22, English composition, to a commuter club school. That's younger than half of my students, which is interesting. And about 1 year or so into teaching, my administrator came to me and said, hey, we've got this great new thing. This was like 1996. We've got this great new thing, online education. We'd love for you to design your research writing class online and deliver it at a distance. I grew up in the mountains. I probably should have at least had an Atari, but I didn't. I minored in medieval literature. Well, I had visions of, writing poetry on vellum in a castle somewhere. And so they presented this to me, and I said, no, thank you. That's weird. I'm in the classroom, finally, They said, well, that's all we have this term. Take it or leave it, adjunct. And so I said, all right, I will bungle my way through this and, get it out of the way, and then I'll get back to, real teaching. Again, keep in mind, this is 1996, 97. Still refused to buy a computer. I went to the student computer lab, had to learn not only how to use email, how to use HTML, because at the time, the LMS systems still weren't WYSIWYG. You had to know some coding. So I developed this very basic online course and started to teach it. And a couple things along the way resonated with me. One, I'm a writing instructor, Everything we're doing is 99% in writing. 2, I'm from a tiny town in Colorado. This online thing might be kind of something cool for the future. So fast forward a couple years, I kept teaching online. I ended up at eCollege, which was at the time the LMS that powered the University of Colorado, and spent about 10 years through course development, instructional design, eventually leading up the academic services team in instructional design. I spent a good 8 years traveling the country teaching teachers how to teach online, which sort of led me in a roundabout way to assessment. Because I kept getting the question, how do you know it's as good as? How do you know students are learning? Especially when it was newer. And there's still some questions about it. And the idea was, well, if you have the same outcomes or the same competencies or the same skill base, and they perform, then they're meeting those outcomes and they're meeting those skills, and it's as good as. And at some point, sometimes they were better as far as outcomes go. So after eCollege, my husband and I moved to Southern California, where I ended up working for a nursing school. And originally, they hired me to do online development. They wanted a presence in the online world, which we did. And then they decided to go from national accreditation to regional accreditation. And then all of a sudden, they needed this assessment house in person, this very specific area to look at assessment, institutional research, and faculty development. And I said, hey, I'm interested in that. And luckily, I was able to pursue that. Founded a center for, we called it the Center for Excellence in Teaching, Learning, and Assessment. We wanted to make sure that assessment was in the name as well. And I was there for about 7 years. And my husband dragged me back to Colorado, kicking and screaming. I loved the weather. He hated the traffic. I get it. And once back in Colorado, I was working from home, but for University of St. Augustine for health sciences. So another health sciences school as Dean of Educational Effectiveness. So running their, again, assessment shop. They had campuses in San Marcos, California, Austin, Texas, and of course, St. Augustine, Florida. And after about 3 years of that, we decided to sell a house, buy an RV, and go travel, which is what we were doing for the past 2 years. So we traveled up the West Coast our first year, up the East Coast just last year, and then my husband got a pretty amazing job opportunity, of course, back in Denver, despite my very hard work at trying to get him to go to someplace warmer. Austin almost made the cut. So we've been back in Colorado since December, still living in an RV, which isn't, the most fun thing when you're not traveling. It's just a small house. And decided to, keep moving. What was able to allow us to travel was, though, this WASC project that I'm working on. So WASC is the regional accreditor for the Western states, well, California mostly, Hawaii and the Channel Islands. And so for the past 2.5 years, as we were roaming around in our RV, I've also been working on a Lumina grant to really look in depth at student learning outcomes, visibility through campuses, and then building leadership capacity around those functions. So I'll be jobless in a few months, which is a little scary, but the contract comes to an end in September. We've put together a community of practice. Institutions from the WASC region put in proposals to be a part of this community of practice, and then we paired them with experts. So Natasha Demkowski from NILOA, Pat Hutchings from NILOA, Linda Susky, who's a national consultant, Kathleen Yancey, a couple other folks who have a national reach, have been mentoring these teams from start to finish in about 2.5 years of implementing some assessment work. So it's been really cool. It's been a great experience. Along the way, I started to become a NILOA assessment coach as well. So I've been doing this for about 1.5 years as well. That's me. So, want to just get an idea of who was brave enough to come today. Since, we were expecting more, and wherever our setup guy is, thank him for putting all of this together. Just want to know a little bit about, what your role is, what you feel the state of assessment is in your world, and if you teach, let me know if you teach. What's your name, please?
My name is Doug Habib, and I'm with our Center for Excellence Teaching and Learning.
Okay.
I've been in the classroom since '98, I think. And taught a lot of both online and face-to-face. I've done course design for the past 4 years or so, and gone through some things like Quality Matters and the like. So when talking about things like outcomes,
You get it?
I get it.
Okay, good. You can come up here now.
And then in terms of assessment, I think here on campus, we're trying to get our hands on assessing classrooms and programs, and are the students doing the things that we think that they're doing? And yeah, sometimes it seems a little murky, sometimes not.
Yeah, the assessment piece?
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, so I'm Steve Byerl. I'm chair in mechanical engineering. So I've been here, this is my 31st year here. So for the last 25 years, I've been involved with our capstone design course, where we do projects with regional industry. So that has a lot of authentic opportunities to get external stakeholders involved. And of course, being a capstone course, everybody wants to try to do all of the assessment pieces. So I guess the challenge is how to do things that are naturalistic and added value for the students, which is like my first and foremost concern. But then if we can get derivative value that we can use in the assessment, the program assessment process. But you don't want to let the tail wag the dog. So I think that's probably what you're going to talk to here. And I've been involved in multiple cycles of the ABET assessment, which is the engineering accreditation. So we're currently writing our self-study.
That's fine.
Sarah's office will be busy analyzing our reports here in a few months, I think.
Self-studies are always good time. Thank you, Steve.
My name is Karen Cryer. I'm the academic advisor for the College of Art and Architecture.
So you know all about charrettes.
My understanding of success assessment is to see how the service delivery and their connection to students from the perspective of how they understand the curriculum, and also from their perspective of the relationship building.
Great, awesome.
Hi, I'm Emily Hill, and I am with the honors program here on campus. So I'm the academic advisor and student engagement coordinator, and I'm sometimes instructor. My experience is I've actually taught for 5.5 years in honors education, so a lot of interdisciplinary courses at another institution. And then I have a similar track. I have my master's in English, so I started in the comp classroom way back when. And right now, my supervisor is looking at doing a program-wide assessment, so that's why I'm here. I'm representing her today. So.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Dean Pantea. I'm the Director of General Education. I've been here as long as Steve. I didn't know that. So I teach, I will be teaching. So we had a short, we can talk about it at lunch, but I'm going to be teaching some classes to make up for the shortfall of our first year experience course. So, but as far as assessment here, I think we have a relatively robust assessment program. I think we're lacking assessing general education.
Okay. Is general education, we can talk more about this too at lunch, is general education considered a program of its own, or just courses that feed into, and I think we talked about
It's kind of complex
Okay.
because it's state mandated to a certain level, and
Okay.
then there's the institutionally designated credits on top of that.
Okay.
So that part is a program. The other part is sort of state board core, so it's kind of complex soup.
Okay. Yeah.
And my name is Sarah Mahiran. I work in the Office of Institutional Effectiveness and Accreditation with Dale back there. And I help coordinate assessment at the program level, the process for the university. And teaching, I don't currently teach. In the past, I've taught English as a second language and student development courses. And yeah.
Everybody knows, does everybody know Sarah?
People know me probably.
Does everybody know everybody? Okay. That's good then.
So my name is Xiao Hu. I'm an associate professor in architecture. So of course I know
You know Sarah as well?
Yes. So one of the university committee I'm working in is actually working with Sarah on the assessment issue. So regarding the role of I'm teaching upper level undergraduate and graduate level courses in architecture. We have a little bit different curriculum because we are professional academic. And actually, which needed to one of the complexity for our assessment is because besides the university and the regional or national accreditation requirement, we have to follow the professional agencies requirement, which is more important for us. So right now, one of our challenges is try to connect those requirements from different agencies because we have multiple agency to guide our student outcome assessment.
Yeah. I worked when I was at the healthcare schools as well. I mean, they of course had CC&E and different and physical therapy, ACOT, those professional standards as well. And what I helped work on with them was this kind of a crosswalk or a matrix to say, okay, what are the professional standards? How can they match up with or crosswalk to the program outcomes or the university outcomes? And then where there was any gaps or anything that needed for the program outcome, then it was appended. So we kind of were able to work the two without it being two separate reports. So, and I think there's great opportunity there because a lot of times when you have, these professional outcomes, they're already there at least, right? So you know the outcomes, you've been working towards outcomes and doing this assessment plan for quite a while. So it actually puts you in a pretty good position. We're doing introductions, name, your role in the university and sort of the state of assessment in the
Sorry.
world. That's okay.
I'm Diane Perec from the library, and I've been involved in working with library assessment for a long time, and I'm a library assessment team. We have kind of an interesting role because our assessment involves both, we're kind of a service unit, which is why I'll probably be here in the afternoon,
Okay.
but also a lot of our assessment involves collaboration with academic classes. So we collaborate a lot to teach information literacy within classes, and therefore we kind of rely on the collaboration and also some of the artifacts from other people. And so it's really kind of complex. We're trying to, we kind of walk both lines, walk both sides of that. So.
That's good though. With the last school I did the coaching for, which is out in Asheville, same sort of thing when we were talking to the librarian, but in her case, she wasn't allowed in the classroom, which I thought was kind of, it was like, the whole co-curricular academic programs, and it was very siloed. So it's good to hear that there's pieces that are actually, integrated into the classroom.
Yeah, there's still more to be done. Yeah.
So, good. All right, thank you.
Ann Abbott, an instructor. I'm not really sure who I belong to, sometimes it's statistics. So I do gen ed classes in both math and statistics, upper division statistics. And I guess just a little bit of background. My first degree is biology. First class I ever taught was anatomy and physiology to play basketball team.
Oh, wow.
So that was kind of fun. And I have a master's in fisheries. Got a master's in statistics so I could be a better biologist. Worked for Forest Service Research for 10 years, so very applied research for managers, very directed. When I was at Gonzaga, I was so focused. All I wanted to be was a biologist. I graduated in 3.5 years. I took every class I could. Elective was another biology class. Hated my gen ed classes. Absolutely despised them. They were just fluff. They got in my way. And as the years have gone by, I really see the value of them.
Yeah.
So about 6 years ago, I had a rather life-altering experience and decided, you know what, this is where my passion really is, even all those years of children. So I completely derailed again. I never intended to teach.
Yeah.
I just wanted to live as far as Texas.
Yeah.
But, gen ed and helping the students see the value of that a lot sooner than I did is, I'm pretty passionate about it.
Good.
And I use all of my classes to improve thinking skills because the way society's going, the lack of that.
Okay. Thank you. I'll step up on my soapbox for just a moment. The whole gen ed thing and the humanities, career services and career readiness and, let's get rid of the humanities, sort of that trend that's happening in a lot of schools, especially those that are not the traditional universities. And they're under a lot of pressure from student loans and, there's some, I get it in some way. But I never went to school thinking, I'm gonna, my English degree is gonna prepare me for something. I went to school and majored in English because that's what I like to do. That's what I love. And along the way, thankfully, I've been successful. But the focus on, get a job, and again, I get the practicality of it, I do. But I also think that the lessening of the gen eds or the humanities, or even, going so far as to say critical thinking as a soft skill or problem solving as a soft skill, when we see all these surveys that, come out from those who are in the job, and they're like, oh, well, they know their subject, but they can't work together, and they can't think, and they can't problem solve. So of course it's, it's very important. And I had a good colleague who was working with the quality assurance comments, and knew her thing, kind of branched off from WASP. And the whole idea was to look at career readiness, but that career readiness was cleverly shielded humanities skills, like critical thinking and problem solving and collaboration. So it's interesting to see how just turning the framework to something that's more practical to today's world has made a difference in how we can think about the gen eds and be passionate about it. But you're right, I mean, especially when I was an English teacher, people just go like, oh, I'm a biologist, why do I have to be in a writing class? So it is interesting. All right, off my soapbox. Yeah.
I'm Dale Petronk, probably most of you know me. I started life as a clinician, not as anything to do with higher ed. And so ended up when I did my doctorate in clinical mental health that I specialized in psychometrics and personality test development and neurological screening test development. It was kind of pretty neat. In that process, started helping the university set up outpatient mental health centers where they could cross-train students as well as work within the state system to provide care for indigent populations. And so a great part of that, of course, is getting yourself accredited within the state that you happen to have your clinic with you. And somehow then through that process, I ended up as a chair of a department where I had to be overseeing the assessment programs and that kind of thing. And School of Education, where that particular program was housed, decided I needed to be doing that. And so they gave me the choice of doing that or doing nothing. So I moved into that role, and from there the university said, we need someone to help us with this for our regional accreditation. We've been tagged with this particular issue, and we need to get in line with it. And so between that and the School of Ed moving to outcome-based stuff, and in those days it was NK, we're making that first big push to outcome-based education. So I've been doing it forever, I think. And I just kind of rotated from school to school, but I taught 15 years as a clinical mental health professional, so that's really kind of how I still view and frame the world.
Thank you. All right, well, thanks for sharing, everybody. This will be helpful for, we will be working in groups of 5-ish, or depending on, who may show up more, we might break those down into 3s, or we'll see. We'll see how it goes. I'm going to sort of stay still so this gentleman doesn't have to do too much. But so we'll talk about some assessment practices. You guys obviously as instructors, as head of assessment offices, clinicians, statistics, biology, I mean all of these as an instructor, this is what you do, right? You assess. The whole assessment movement really picked up speed about 20 years ago, and surprisingly not, it's driven by accreditation, which I have, very mixed feelings about, even though I work for an accreditor. This might be a little difficult for you to see if you're too far back. Oh, by the way, before you, start taking pictures or, scribbling too furiously, I'll send these to Sarah and you'll get them, probably early next week sometime. But if you think about, I think really the paradigm shift has been over the past 30, 40 years, maybe even a little more recently, is not so much do we do assessment or is assessment being done, but rather the kind of shift from teacher-centered to student-centered. So instead of it being all about I'm the instructor and I've got the information and here I'll magically pour it into your heads, and hopefully you've got good students and they're paying attention to your lectures and all that good stuff. But really shifting the focus to what do the students need, how can we effectively instruct so that the students are getting it. The idea of capstone and authentic assessment and all of that comes in play as well. So I think it's really just a matter of shifting the perspective to learners constructing their own learning plans perhaps, coaching learners around the performance, to expertise, encouraging multiple perspectives of course, situating learning in real-life activities or that authentic assessment, prompting learners to think about their thinking. So of course, metacognition, self-reflection, self-assessment is a big deal. Guide learners to think like an expert. And that's a big thing in assessment and evaluation, is what does that mean to reach expertise or mastery? So, how many of you have seen or have worked on your program curriculum maps? Yeah, sort of. You all should have one. You all should see them. And in fact, I'm going to advocate that your students should see them too, but that's a little bit, more like a student plan or a pathway. The idea of classing outcomes from is it introductory, is it applied or reinforced, and then usually you see this thing called mastery, which we'll talk about curriculum maps a little bit too. And it doesn't have to mean that they're an expert, because very rarely do you become a master in topics. I mean, unless you get a terminal degree, and then even then I'd argue that there's still stuff to learn, right? So the whole idea of what expert means at different levels, I think, is important here, especially when you're thinking about outcomes, especially when you're thinking about where does my class or my classes sit in the overall experience of the students, and what level should they be displaying on their competencies or their outcomes. And I could argue that, even as a freshman, you would master a certain skills to some level. But it gets a little tricky. So just the whole idea of thinking like an expert and what equals mastery, that's something that as faculty you would want to discuss and you would want to understand among yourselves, is what does that look like and what does that mean? Evaluate learners' thinking process. So the process of learning. I was not great in math. I was an English instructor. And so the whole idea of when, in math classes, you'd have to show your work. Oh my gosh, that was the worst thing in the world to me. It was I don't know how I memorized it, right? Is usually how I got through math classes. So the idea of process and how do you reach that answer is really important, I think, in a learner-centered environment as well. All right, so effective practices. This is from NILOA. This is from a little while ago, too, 2012. And using assessment results, promising practices of institutions that do it well. So these are just some characteristics of what good assessment can be. It's embedded into the institutional process. So a lot of times when I get pushback, or when you hear pushback, and Sarah probably hears this sometimes too, about the assessment process and program assessment, is that it's another thing to do. It's a bolt-on activity. And that's the piece that I advocate to not happen. Yes, there are program reviews, and that's great, but the actual pieces of assessing to get to that program level should just be embedded in the whole process. Signature assignments is one way to do that. Obviously, classroom assignments linked to outcomes is the main way to do that. You want to provide a vision for assessment. So this starts, again, the work that I'm doing for the grant, looking at leadership and capacity around the visibility of student learning outcomes. How is the leadership positioning the assessment work? Is it, oh, we've got a self-study due, or oh, we got dinged from our accreditor, and this is what we need to do now? Is it episodic? So it's oh, if we just get through this next self-study, we'll be okay. And then it's kind of forgotten until the next self-study. I would say that's probably not the best practice for assessment, to feel like it really is just a part of what we do as faculty and as a program. Provide and encourage space for discussion, collaboration, and reflection. So this is where I think program reviews can be really effective. If I don't trip over that at some point today, it'll be good. Have the ability for faculty to reflect on the work that their students are doing, reflect on the data that comes back to say, how are students doing overall? That part to reflect, to collaborate, to discuss is really important, because nothing's more frustrating, for me as a faculty member as well, to do these things that are our work, and some of it's embedded in the process, but we do know that some of it, especially for program review, is a little bit added on. The worst thing to happen is to get all those data out there and have nothing come back. And so all the work of assessment and process and pulling those results and thinking about those results, they go into some black box, usually an accreditation report. Sometimes they go into the strategic plan, which they absolutely should. But oftentimes faculty are not made aware of those results as a whole and what can be done next. So just like we expect, learning for students to continue in kind of a circular motion, that's really what should be happening with everybody in here as well. Is we get the results from how students are doing in not only my classroom, in the program, and now what do we do about it? Do we celebrate? Yes, of course, because there are going to be some really good results. But then if students aren't meeting outcomes where you think they should be, what do we do about it? And that usually happens in the classroom or in co-curricular, so library can help with that as well. Engage faculty in fostering ownership of an assessment. How many of you as faculty members feel you own the assessment process in your classroom? How many of you feel like you own the assessment process in your program? Yeah. It should all be yours, and it should all be reflective of that. Share information widely. So like I said, once those data are collected, once the results are determined, where are those sticking points? That's where you really need a good IR person to say, hey, these are, or a good statistics person to say, hey, this is where I see some trends. Maybe students should be reinforcing, a certain mastery level of an outcome, but they're not. What might be some of the issues around that? How can we help? Those are the great discussions that happen around assessment. That's when assessment really actually can be fun. It's probably not collecting the data. Unless you're a statistics person, it's probably not analyzing the data. But it's really being able to take those trends and doing something in the process. And as instructors and lifelong learners, as a faculty member, that's where I think the exciting things can happen. Engage stakeholders. So we see a lot in accreditation especially is, are your assessment results being used in strategic budgeting, strategic planning? And it really should be. And oftentimes it's not. Or if it is, it's done behind closed doors and you never know what comes of it. So the stakeholders and the robust assessment processes across the board, I think, are really important for that overall embedded assessment feeling. Like it's just kind of in the DNA. The assessment process and continually looking at what is the assessment doing or assessing the assessment. Maybe the rubric isn't the right one. Maybe an evaluation exam isn't right to begin with. Maybe the capstone classes are taking on too much and people aren't really looking at the summative assessment plans along the way. So there's a lot that can happen with just looking at, is the assessment process itself correct? Transparency in the assessment process. I mean, when I first started talking about assessment and even in online courses for faculty, the whole idea that somebody's looking in on me as a faculty member really freaked people out. And so the whole idea too, when assessment started becoming bigger and more mandated in colleges, there was a little bit of a sense from faculty like, oh, I'm being evaluated through the assessment process. And so how it's positioned and how much faculty are involved at the program level and course level, obviously, and even at the institutional level, I think can display a lot of transparency. And it's really important to understand what is your role as a faculty member and how are those assessment results going to be used or not used. That's obviously something that needs to happen at the university level, but transparency across the board, and even to students, I think not even to students, especially to students, is very important. Treat assessment as inquiry. So a lot of us, I think, have gotten into education, have gotten into the subject matters and teaching because we're interested, we're curious, we want to see what happens. So treating the whole assessment process at the program level especially can really foster curiosity and make, again, the assessment process a little more fun than sometimes it often is. Use student learning evidence to improve. I mean, this sounds pretty much like a no-brainer, but oftentimes, again, it's sort of lost at that point where we collect the data, we turn it into somebody analyzes it, it goes into some report, and I just go back to the classroom and do what I've always been doing. And they'll ask me for some results again at some point. The idea is, and I'm not saying that's exactly what's happening here, but the idea is that evidence is taken to improve, to do something with, to turn it back into the instructional process. Today, as we look at your assignments, or as you look at your assignments, think of ways that it can be improved based on the outcomes and how students are or maybe aren't meeting those outcomes to the level is appropriate for them. So it's always using that evidence that you bring in to improve the process. And most importantly, celebrate success. Assessment can be difficult, especially putting it in a whole of a program or university-wide. It's a lot of work, let's face it, but so is instructing overall. So it's important to celebrate those moments of success where students are meeting their outcomes, where everybody's putting into practice something from a strategic plan, and being able to even come together and have those collaborative discussions. That should be a celebration. Nowhere in here in effective practices from NILOA does it say meet accreditor needs. But we do know that accreditors do have standards around assessment. And generally, they rely on best practices. So it's not like the accreditors came out and said, oh, hey, we're going to make University of Idaho's lives miserable by imposing these ideas on standards and outcomes. It makes sense. It's something that I think really should happen regardless. And so on the one hand, when I say it's kind of a mixed bag between having accreditors require this of institutions, on the other hand, it makes people like me who are in the assessment process say, hey, this is something we have to do. That's not the best reason to do it, but sometimes it gets a fire lit and it will get some processes and practices started that really just make sense. I mean, if you guys have heard this before, if you say you want your students to learn or do something and to demonstrate it, don't you want to know that they have in fact demonstrated it? And that again, I think is a little bit of a paradigm shift from 50 years ago, where it's like, well, I taught them, and hopefully they'll go and do well. But now we really, we want to know. And it's not just instructors, and it's not just accreditors, parents, watchdogs, all of these things, especially with the more savvy that students and consumers get about the whole idea of especially student debt, are they getting their money's worth? That whole culture has created more need for transparent outcomes assessment. So parents are asking, students should be asking. We look to express student achievement in multiple audiences and stakeholders. So just what I was noting, students should be able to understand the assessment process. Your students should know their program outcomes. And they should probably know where they stand with their outcomes. The whole idea of self-assessment comes into play. That means that you as instructors need to be talking about these outcomes, linking assignments to outcomes, helping students understand how they're being evaluated and why it matters, because it's linking to an outcome that the university has as well. It is a sort of consumer protection in some ways, so that if students want to come to a website, or parents or regulators want to come to any university website and see how students are doing with the outcomes the university says they're going to help students learn, then they should have some sort of results to see that. It's very difficult to have a website. One of the projects that we're working on through the Lumina grant is a student achievement website. WASC has the requirement that every university in the WASC region has a student achievement website that's publicly viewable. We don't tell them how to define student achievement. We don't tell them what exactly those pieces need to display, but you would think it has to do with outcomes achievement, right? And success of the students after graduation. We see a lot of graduation rates, persistence, that sort of thing, which I would call those bright line indicators of student success. Are students starting and finishing on time? Are they graduating? Student debt also has something to play in there as well. And that could be student achievement. It's one aspect of student achievement, but it's a lot more. So when you start thinking about student achievement or student outcomes and what's really important here, looking at triangulation and drawing together a number of different pieces is what is really important. Statistics folks know this. So it could be something around, student exams from the class, surveys, so the indirect outcomes, signature assignments as well. Ooh, got fancy for a second. So all of these pieces that ask students to display or do or know are put together to form a bigger picture of what that is. So obviously you're putting together what the students, for the program review, different areas from the student perspective of achievement. Course outcomes, yes. So signature assignments, that can definitely, and when I say signature assignment, does everybody know what I'm talking about? Yeah, no? Maybe? Okay, so a signature assignment, or it can also be an embedded assessment. is something that's placed in specific courses that allow you to look at program outcomes. So it's kind of killing two birds with one stone. So it's not that, added bolt-on activity. One assignment can serve a couple of purposes. One, it can serve, the outcomes within the course, but then it can also be lifted up or, driven upwards to the program outcome as well. So it's linked to a program outcome. Those are the assignments that then the results would be taken and analyzed and looked at the program level. So those specific assignments that are sprinkled into different classes to look at specific program outcomes, which should also be linked to course outcomes, those results can be used for program assessment. So that's what a signature assignment is. Exams, we all are pretty familiar with that. And then the surveys, you can survey students on student learning outcomes. You can use, something like the NESI survey or the student perspective survey, those sorts of things. Anything that's perspective from the student is indirect evidence, but it's really important as a part of triangulation and how the students are doing overall. Program review. Obviously look over time at students' achievement. So generally program reviews happen every 5 to 7 years. In between there, of course, then you're going to have what I'll call assessment reports. So annual assessment reports should be taken into consideration. So you don't want to wait until capstone class to see whether or not students are actually doing well with their outcomes. You certainly don't want to wait until they're ready to graduate to see if they're doing all right on the program level. So do you know how often program reviews are held?
Historically, it's been every 7 years.
Mm-hmm. And usually that correlates pretty nicely to how many program outcomes there are and the ability to be able to have solid evidence or enough data to analyze and make some sort of determination about what that says about student learning over time. And that's where the different pieces come into play, triangulation. So not only are they the student achievement of embedded outcomes, student achievement perhaps in capstone courses, and then being able to look at each individual outcome from a program and make those holistic determinations. It's a culmination of data from student learning artifacts, again, plus the other data that indicate success or student achievement, those bright line indicators, graduation rates, retention, student affairs, so co-curricular pieces can be brought into this as well. Oftentimes they're reviewed by committees, so there can be assessment committees. Sarah, I'm going to ask you to chime in too. What here is it an assessment committee that reviews the program?
So we've had an external program review committee as well as an external review from peers.
Okay. Yeah, that's pretty typical of schools that I've worked with. Faculty are often a part of the committee. External reviewers, like you said, Sarah, are generally a part as well. Faculty should be involved in the program reviews, whether it's getting them together as being a part of the committees, but they should have some insight and be able to report back to other faculty groups as well. Strategically oriented. So again, not only is it looking specifically at program outcomes and how do we help students learn or get to the next step, but it really should even filter into budgeting and individual department needs, perhaps even around faculty hiring. Do more faculty need to happen? We, at West Coast University, one of the schools that I worked at, if you were requesting new budget information or new budget monies, it had to be linked back to some student outcome and how it will help students either better meet or meet student outcomes. And so that was specifically involved in the program. Now at another university that I worked for, they said that, and they'd supply all of this information around their budget requests, and it was disregarded. So imagine how that felt to the faculty who said, yes, if you're the program director or chair, said, yeah, here's some data around student outcomes, and I'm going to couple that with a budget request. And it was a requirement to do so, and yet it would still just come from some other office that, oh, okay, here's your budget. Probably didn't work well. It didn't work well. Opportunities from program review. They can fulfill, of course, accreditor and regulator needs. And that's a good side project for that. And it's just, oh, by the way, we're doing really great assessment, and it's going to fulfill a need from the accrediting body. It can fulfill community and employer needs. So again, we're talking about How do we build students' soft skills or career readiness in any certain program? Some programs have very specific outcomes that are needed. Dale and I were joking, as we were talking this morning, nobody's going to die if they can't put a 5-paragraph essay together. I mean, I might a little, my students are doing that, but no one's really going to die. If they're out in the nursing world or in the hospital and they don't get their outcomes right, somebody could be, really in trouble. So outcomes can certainly meet a variety of needs. It should inform strategy and budget, so resource, faculty, student needs, as I mentioned, and it should all be based on those outcomes and how students are performing around them, or not. So thinking too about, just beyond your course, beyond the program, and looking then at institutional effectiveness. So it all builds on one another. So as you think about outcomes and how students are doing within the classroom, and then you look at it, say, in a program review, and then I don't know if you have institutional reviews or, different departments, it just depends on the size. I know at one of the schools I worked for, it was pretty small, so we had institutional effectiveness reviews every year. And those would include all the programs, but there weren't, 500 of them. So the way that it can really be brought back and improved, of course, is where the rubber meets the road, and that's in the classroom. So instructional techniques. Is content presented in multiple ways? Is it conducive to the task at hand? That's something that we're going to look at as we go into our charrette. Content preparation and sequencing. So this is where your curriculum map comes into play. Are students asked to display some sort of mastery before they're even introduced to the topic? And that can come down to, a smaller level at your classroom too, or a more myopic level at your classroom, and saying, are students really learning what they need to as far as content before they're asked to demonstrate it? And you'd be surprised how many curriculum maps I've looked at over the years that are asking students to do something pretty high level before they're even introduced to a concept. And so if you think of that in your own classroom, that scaffolding, of course, is something that's really important. And you guys know that. Improving the institution through instructional effectiveness. So based on student achievement of outcomes, what could be improved? So if students aren't doing well, you can take some time to come back to your information and your content and say, is the rubric designed well? Is the exam designed well? Maybe it's not the content at all. Maybe it's not even the student learning at all. Maybe it's just the wrong way to assess. So are any parts of the assignments unclear? Again, we'll take a look at that today. So just thinking back on how the outcomes are coming out, and then taking those evidence pieces back to your classroom, and how can those pieces be improved? All right, I'm going to take a breath and see if you guys have questions. All right. No questions?
It's just one thing that,
Yeah.
in terms of just managing potential chaos.
Managing what, I'm sorry?
Potential chaos.
Yeah. Yes?
As faculty, we can get together and formulate learning outcomes for our classes, which are definitely a jumping off point.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of having learners that construct their plans, you definitely want to do that within reason or within certain boundaries. So,
When you say conduct their plans, what do you mean?
well, just in your cycle, the first step was the learners construct
Oh,
plans.
there, yeah.
So the classes have certain boundaries, and certainly you want to understand student needs within that context. But like in my engineering classes, there could be things where Dale would really like to do more of a counseling approach. And so I don't know if you want to just elaborate a little bit.
Sure. So when I'm thinking about having students conduct or construct learning plans, I'm thinking broader in terms of a program.
Okay.
So, and sometimes it's going to be managed by the actual degree itself, but that's when the fun comes, and this is where managing chaos comes into play too, is with gen ed, as the electives. How are those, and what students can choose on their own?
Okay.
So the ability for them to be able to adequately choose a learning path. And you could do it in a classroom, for sure. But it becomes a little,
Yeah, I
actually,
guess
easier.
your explanation makes more sense. So it's more the holistic thing
Yeah.
across the courses and sort of connected with their life vision.
Yes.
So it's not, molecularized. For
Right,
each
right.
class.
You could do that, but that's not what I was thinking of. But thank you for the opportunity to clarify. Because that's just looking at, is there a way for the students to put this together in a scaffolded way? And that's where advising and, the co-curricular can really be helpful as well, is how are these going to fit into their own curriculum map or their own pathway?
Yeah, a question on potential pushback from faculty.
Yes? Yes, there will be pushback.
Yeah, and one of the things you mentioned was using assessment budgeting, and I'm sitting here thinking, well, there's a threat. And,
Oh, not an opportunity, but
right.
yeah.
Have you, or what's your experience in taking something that can be interpreted as a threat and saying, no, actually, this is an opportunity?
I think that's where it really has to do with vision and leadership. And so, my one example of, budgeting coming from faculty. So the faculty supply a lot of the outcomes and the evidence within it. It's really up to the department chair or program chair to be able to take that, or however the institution is structured, to take that to the next level, wherever the budgeting is happening. It's just like when you do something for a survey for students and they say, oh, we've been asking for a vending machine in, this hallway for years and you're not listening to me, it doesn't happen. It's the same sort of thing with faculty. Faculty say, oh, I really need this whiteboard, technology-wise in the classroom and it'll help. And it's not every single thing is not going to get accepted, right? But if you can have those moments where overall a program is granted maybe, new licenses to a cool technology based on evidence from student outcomes that it's either working or not, that can really, pull up the idea that what they're supplying is actually going to be used. As far as the threat goes, that could be the opposite and say, well, our students are doing okay, they're doing, there's no real reason or need for budgeting. And so they can feel like it's just staying stagnant for a while and nothing's ever getting approved. And so there's this whole idea, and I've heard this from a couple of institutions actually, about intentional sort of sabotaging of outcomes so they can get budgeting needs fulfilled. I don't know if it ever happened, but I've heard it talked about. So, I think there's always an opportunity to turn something that's well-meaning into a threat. And I think faculty sometimes have a way, and I can say this because I'm one too, have a way of turning things around to it being like, oh, well, they're going to use this against me somehow. And the idea that, if students aren't meeting certain outcomes in a course, then it kind of becomes an idea of professional development, potentially, piece for the faculty, or a deeper dive into looking at, what is the content looking like? How does the scaffolding build up? And so it should always be looked at as a professional development opportunity and not an evaluation opportunity, but that's a fine line if students aren't performing in a course. So I don't have a good answer for how to help it move from an opportunity to a threat, but a lot of times what needs to happen is some sort of momentum within the university or within a department to see that assessment is being used for good and not evil. And that will build up. And having champions, people, that's why faculty should be involved in program review and institutional review if possible, so that they can come back to faculty and say, oh, here's what's going on, here's what we learned, so the transparency becomes very key to help faculty not feel like it's a threat in any way. That helped a little. Yeah.
I'm not sure if this is really related or not, but assessment and having the students take a piece of this, take some ownership.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have suggestions for how to encourage the students to see some value in, I'll just use undergraduate math and statistics. They don't want to be classes.
No, I have no way to do it for them.
But then at the same time, how do we really assess the effectiveness of that? Because it's not just about how they do in those classes. Why do they need those classes? Mm-hmm. And is it effective? What
yeah.
and curriculum
I mean, I think the idea that you can allow students to be more a part of their own process, so certainly transparency within your own assessment methods as well. You know, for many years, battled instructors are like, why would I want to share the rubric with my students? Sort of mentality. It's like, well, why wouldn't you? You know, so the whole idea of the transparency in the assessment process in your own course, I think gives students a lot of ownership. And you want to take it a step further, having them use a rubric or a practice exam or something like that to assess their own skills, I think can really give them help. As far as kind of building up the idea of their own pathway, maybe they have 2 different assignments. I mean, that's harder for the instructor, I get it, but to be able to say, oh, I'd rather choose this way of displaying my knowledge in math than the exam. So having the ability to be a part of decisions within the class, I think helps build the assessment piece. Building the value of certain topics, I think is just going to be something that's a little more difficult always because people are drawn to different topics. Anything that you can do to bring it back to the quote-unquote real world or that authentic experience, I think is going to help them see the value. So if you can draw in what they hope to be when they grow up and find ways that, you can draw in where math is used or statistics. And goodness knows with information literacy, I mean, that's one of the bigger things that I don't think people totally get, that that's all, math and statistics that come up with a lot of these info literacy graphics. And how easily they can be tricked by math. That seems to be one of the big, I'm teaching intro to graduate research. And that's the thing too, of statistics, to really, get people a little more hooked on it as, oh, let's take a look at every single graph on CNN and what it really goes into that. And they start thinking, it's critical thinking now, it's problem solving, it's all these things that a lot of times people don't associate with math and statistics. So just opportunities to help them draw in experiences when they can, and sometimes they can't. Any other questions? No? Okay, I'm going to delve into some effective assignment practices, and then we'll give you a little break, and then you'll get to work. So this is really taking in the idea of not just, creating effective assignments, which you all have done in the past, but honing in on what effective strategies can be for that improvement of it. So they need to be intentional, of course, clear sense of purpose, aligning with outcomes, aligning with how the classes are scaffolded within the program. This sounds like, again, a no-brainer, but sometimes it's not the clearest thing in the world, but assignments should be clear to students. And they should have the opportunity, at the very least, to answer or to ask questions about it. So assignments, their purposes should be clear, why they're being asked to do it, so that connection. These are things that I would have dreamed of asking my instructor, say as a freshman in college. Explicit about the evaluation. How are they going to be evaluated? How are they going to be assessed? What's the tool? What's the exam? Is it a rubric? Can they get their eyes on these things? And the transparency that's important for faculty within the assessment process at the university is also important for students within their courses and their programs. Hopefully they're engaging, and some students are not, to your point, it's not going to resonate with every single student that, oh yeah, this math test is the best thing that's ever happened to me, or that writing this essay is the best thing that's ever happened to me. Students are not always going to completely get it, but the more that you can link it to an outcome in the class, the more you can link it to the outcome in the overall program or degree, the better it's going to be for the students to understand, why they're even doing it in the first place. They should be linked and aligned with other assignments. So if you think about curriculum mapping and how that overall courses should be scaffolded and linked to one another within a degree program, assignments should be linked and connected within the courses themselves. What else? What do your assignments do that help students really get engaged or see the value of not just the topic, but perhaps the link with the outcomes. Well, you'll get to talk about it.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, it might be, there's the assignment, and then students just want to get the assignment done.
Yeah.
So having some sort of self-assessment at the
Yes.
end of, okay, what did I do well, what can I improve on, and then how does this, it's not over yet, I mean, how does this play into what I might do next?
Right, right. I love the idea of self-assessment.
Try
Love
and design the assignment so it makes them take what they've learned one step farther on their own, to take it beyond. For instance, I teach monsters, and I teach a certain subset of monsters.
it. I'll
And
take that
the
class.
final project makes them take one step farther on exploring what other monsters we haven't talked about,
Nice. Okay.
putting it in their own context.
Yeah, good. That's good. That's the aligning and building upon as well with self-assessment. Okay. What else? What other things do effective assignments do? Have you ever allowed your students to choose their own assignment? I've never done it, but I've heard.
You can have them choose how they're going to accomplish the assignment or what the medium is.
Yeah, that's one piece.
Yeah.
Or make their own assignment.
Mhm.
I had a couple of brave faculty members tell me about that experience at one point, but. I think when I was early on in my online days, I was thinking of like, what would be the coolest online course ever? And, at the time I was really into like learning styles, and, since then people have gone back and forth of whether or not that's really a thing or not. I mean, people have, perspectives on how they learn best, but my ultimate online course would be to design something that allowed each person to say, based on my learning styles, I'm going to accomplish the assignment this way. So the assignments and the content even would be presented. It would have been way too much money to do, so it never happened. But would be, if you are a visual learner, here's your path for learning this content, and here's your specific assignment. If you're an auditory learner, here's another way to go through this specific content and assignment. And I always thought that would be the coolest thing ever. It'd be an assessment nightmare, and it would also be really expensive to build. But how cool would that be? Well, it's kind of choose your own adventure course. Other questions or thoughts on assignments?
I think just to follow up on the comments you make, because often I think about the assignment we give student in class, and the assignment the student normally, with the computer game, they get an assignment.
Amy.
So there's a different level of motivation.
Mm-hmm.
I think giving a choice will really improve their motivation.
Mm-hmm.
Because although the assignment is under a certain framework, but at least they give them a freedom. They have freedom to make different choices depending on their different condition. So I think sometimes I do give students the choices, but I do give them a kind of like a background framework. So and all the choices just under that framework, and there's nothing beyond that framework. That really gives students a certain kind of like engagement, because earlier you talked about how students engage in their assessment process.
Yeah.
I'm not sure other discipline, but for architecture, it's a little bit different discipline because there's no like a hard science. 1 + 1 certainly is 2. In architecture, it could be 3, could be anything. So there are a lot of self-assessment really upon subjective judgment and decisions. So that really gives students this, motivation to engage in assignment and self-assessment.
Right.
But I think in hard science is a little bit different because there's some kind of like a different kind of area. But I want to stick to my discipline. I think for me, I think that works pretty Well,
Yeah, I think it would. I mean, obviously you don't want the building to fall down, or the bridge to fall down, right? So there's
Yeah.
some pieces that have to be present. Yeah, I mean, the whole idea of ownership and engagement for the students, I mean, that really can help. And so if there are opportunities to allow students within that framework, like you mentioned, to pick a couple of different ways to go about an assignment, I think that can be really useful, for sure.
Is that related to, or is that the same thing as allowing students to design the assessment criteria?
It could be. I mean, you definitely want to frame it again, have
Right.
it in some sort of
Right.
realm that's going to make sense. But if they can come up with their own assessment of a project that they're working on, then, I mean, that's a good indicator that they know if it's a good assessment, if they know what they're doing. That'd be
So-
difficult.
So also
Okay.
for me, I think if I need to add something, these days, we would include the self-assessment as part of the assignment.
Yeah, I've done that before too. I mean, part of their, turning in a paper or something would be to include the rubric in their own. Yeah. And that gives them ownership, again, and the, metacognition and all that good stuff that goes with it. But, okay. Well, keeping all those in mind, take about 5 minutes, and then you're gonna come back and get to work. All right? Thank you. That's the end of the first day. Yeah, this will just be guiding them through that.